Ashlyn Carter never expected her life to unravel before it even began. At 24, she was a third-year law student at Savannah College, smart, focused, and on track to become everything her hard-working parents had dreamed of. Her world was structured: classes, internships, and her long-term boyfriend, Cameron Blake, a civil engineering student with a promising future. They were the kind of couple people envied, two bright young souls with their futures aligned. Everyone saw them as a power duo, destined for greatness. Ashlyn believed that too. Cameron was charming, articulate, and endlessly supportive, at least that's how it seemed. He brought her coffee during late-night study sessions, left sticky notes on her laptop reminding her to smile, and promised her the world when they would both graduate. He was her safe place, her home in a chaotic world. But everything collapsed in one afternoon. It was a rainy Friday, the kind where the streets of Savannah glistened with oil-slick reflections, and the air smelled of wet pavement and old moss. Ashlyn had just submitted a brief she'd worked on for days. She wanted to celebrate. She headed to Cameron's apartment unannounced, her heart light, carrying his favorite takeout. The door wasn't locked. That in itself was odd. The apartment smelled like sandalwood and something else, perfume, floral and unfamiliar. The living room lights were off, but the bedroom door was slightly ajar. Her footsteps slowed. She heard muffled laughter, a voice that wasn't his. Then Cameron's.
Ashlyn froze, à ta ring.
She didn't have to push the door.
609. Clotte on the floor.
A shadow in his bed that didn't belong to her. Her lungs burned as she stood still, gripping the paper bag in her hands so tightly the handles ripped. He didn't notice her until she dropped the food. Ashlyn, Cameron scrambled, his voice panicked. But she didn't stay to hear the rest. She walked out into the rain, tears mixing with the downpour. Her world, once defined by clarity and purpose, turned to static. She wandered the city for hours, ignoring texts, ignoring calls. She didn't go home. She went to the only place she had left that wasn't filled with betrayal, Malik's. Malik Johnson had been her closest friend since high school. A literature major turned youth counselor, Malik had always been a quiet, grounded presence in her life. He never tried to be anything but supportive. And when she knocked on his door that night, drenched and shaking, he didn't ask why. He just opened his arms. They didn't talk much that evening. She curled up on his couch under a fleece blanket. He brewed tea. She tried to hold it together but eventually broke down. "I thought he was my forever," she whispered, staring at the ceiling. "I thought I mattered." "You do," Malik said, his voice low. "He just didn't deserve to have you." Later she cried again, this time in his arms. One thing led to another. It was soft, clumsy, born of desperation and pain.
Not passion.
Not love. The next morning, both of them knew it was a mistake. A line had been crossed. Ashlyn dressed without looking Malik in the eye. He stood by the window, hands in his hoodie pocket, unsure whether to speak. "We were both hurting," she said, breaking the silence. "But that wasn't supposed to happen." Malik nodded slowly. "I know. I'm sorry." "I'm not angry," she said, forcing a small smile. "But we can't let it happen again." He nodded again. And that was it. She left, and for a long time, neither of them brought it up again. Ashlyn buried that night in the farthest corner of her mind. She focused on rebuilding her life, finishing school, and applying for a position at a non-profit legal clinic. She told herself it was a one-time mistake, an error in judgment in the midst of grief. It didn't define her. 6 months later, Cameron showed up again. He found her at her internship office, waiting with a bouquet of white roses, the kind she used to keep in her dorm window. He looked different. Tired. Humbled. He said he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. That he'd broken things off with the girl from that night the next day. That he'd been in therapy. That losing Ashlyn had shattered him. "I know I don't deserve it," he said, "but I want another chance."
You want to be better for you.
Ashlyn didn't answer right away. She told him she needed time, and he respected that. For weeks, he sent her letters. Not texts, not emails. Letters. Handwritten notes filled with memories, apologies, and hopes for the future. She hated that part of her still loved him. And the night her father had a minor stroke, when she had to fly back to Montgomery, Alabama for 2 weeks, Cameron drove 6 hours just to sit in the hospital with her. He brought food, talked to her mom, helped with insurance paperwork. He didn't make any grand gestures. He just showed up. When her father stabilized, Ashlyn allowed herself to think, maybe people really do change. They started slowly. Coffee. Long walks.
No pressure.
Cameron never brought up the past unless she did. He didn't try to fix things overnight. He simply tried. By the fall, he proposed. And she said yes. They had a small wedding by the riverside in Charleston, surrounded by family, classmates, and former professors. Malik wasn't there. She didn't invite him. She wasn't sure if it was guilt, shame, or fear, but some parts of the past were better left untouched. Ashlyn believed for a while that she had chosen wisely, that she'd closed the door on one chapter and opened another with maturity and grace. But life has a way of circling back. And sometimes, buried things don't stay buried. Marriage, Ashlyn discovered, was both simpler and more complicated than she had expected. Simpler in the daily rhythms, 2 people sharing coffee, bills, and Netflix passwords. More complicated in the quiet expectations, the unspoken wounds that neither fully knew how to name. The first few months after the wedding were warm, peaceful, and strangely fragile. Ashlyn and Cameron moved into a modest 2-bedroom apartment near downtown Charleston. She joined a local nonprofit as a junior legal advocate for low-income families. Cameron accepted a job with a construction firm working on sustainable infrastructure projects. They had their own routines, Ashlyn rising early for court prep, Cameron working late at construction sites. Their weekends were spent at flea markets, walking trails, or occasionally driving to Savannah for nostalgia. But despite the harmony, Ashlyn sometimes caught herself watching him too closely. Watching the way his smile lingered or didn't, the way he hesitated before touching her back in passing. Trust, she realized, wasn't something that returned whole. It came back in fragments, and some days it didn't come at all. Still, she tried. She packed his lunches with handwritten notes. She asked about his projects even when she didn't understand engineering jargon. She smiled through the occasional awkward silence at dinner when neither knew what to say. For his part, Cameron made a visible effort. He listened more, snapped fewer judgments, and learned to hold space for her anger when it rose unexpectedly. But there were moments, rare, subtle, when Ashlyn felt like she was walking through a house where someone had painted over a crack instead of repairing the wall. She knew the crack was still there. She just didn't know when it might reopen. Then came the pregnancy. It wasn't planned. Ashlyn found out after a week of fatigue and strange cravings. At first, she was stunned. Cameron was overjoyed. He lifted her in the kitchen when she told him, spinning her like they were in a rom-com. "We're going to be parents," he whispered into her shoulder.
This is it, Ash. Our fresh start.
And for a time, it truly felt like one. Ashlyn's pregnancy progressed well. She took a temporary leave from work in her second trimester and spent more time nesting, reading parenting books, planning the nursery, and attending prenatal yoga classes. Cameron became even more attentive, painting the nursery himself in soft earth tones, reading baby books aloud at night with exaggerated voices. Then came the first ultrasound. Twins. Ashlyn laughed when the technician announced it, thinking the woman was joking.
Cameron stared at the monitor, slack jawed.
"I guess we're overachievers," he joked nervously. But during her 30-week checkup, a third heartbeat was detected. Triplets. Ashlyn sat frozen as the doctor calmly explained the complications and extra care that would be needed. Her body, her emotions, her plans, everything felt suddenly dwarfed by the weight of this unexpected news. Triplets.
3 lives.
At once. Cameron tried to stay calm, but the stress began to show. He worked longer hours. He fell asleep on the couch with spreadsheets still open. Ashlyn grew lonely in the 3rd trimester, often pacing the apartment at night with swollen ankles and a heart full of fear. The baby shower became a whispered affair, half excitement, half concern. Her mother, visiting from Montgomery, took over the nursery with a quiet determination. Cameron's parents sent an expensive stroller system from out of state but didn't attend. When the babies arrived, Jaden, Noah, and Micah, it was the most painful, exhausting, and surreal moment of Ashlyn's life. They were premature, born at 35 weeks via emergency C-section. But they were breathing.
Alive.
Perfect. except for the moment Cameron saw them. Ashlyn will never forget the expression on his face. He had walked into the room with balloons and roses, wearing that boyish grin he always used when nervous. But when he reached the bassinet and saw his sons, 3 tiny brown-skinned infants wrapped in blue, his smile faltered. It was just a flicker.
À microsecond.
But Ashlyn caught it. He didn't say anything at first. He touched each boy's forehead, held Jaden's hand. Nurses snapped pictures.
Her mother criait softly in the corner.
And Cameron kissed her on the forehead and whispered, "You did amazing." But something in his voice was distant. That night, as Ashlyn tried to breastfeed and recover, Cameron sat in the corner chair scrolling through his phone. He barely spoke. When a nurse walked in and joked that the boys would be heartbreakers someday with their deep eyes and golden skin, he offered a polite laugh and said nothing more. Ashlyn asked him what was wrong.
Et hésita-t-elle.
Then said, "Nothing. I'm just tired." But the next morning, when he thought she was asleep, she heard him speaking to the nurse in the hallway.
Is it normal?
I mean, for babies to look different from both parents. The question was quiet, but it echoed in her ears like thunder. Ashlyn didn't confront him right away. Instead, she let the silence stretch. The unspoken wound between them began to fester. Cameron started leaving the hospital earlier in the evenings. He didn't post photos of the boys on social media. He didn't tell his parents right away that they'd arrived. She felt it, his retreat. The same kind of slow withdrawal that had come after his betrayal years ago. Except now it was quieter, more insidious. Now it was about their children. By the time they brought the boys home, the tension was almost unbearable. Cameron's mother visited 2 weeks later. She stood by the cribs, her lips pursed, silent. Ashlyn offered coffee. The woman declined. Later that night, Ashlyn overheard her whispering to Cameron in the kitchen. "They're beautiful, but they look nothing like you." Ashlyn walked in mid-sentence. Cameron stopped talking. His mother blushed and muttered something about needing sleep. Ashlyn didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She already knew what they were all thinking, what they feared to ask aloud. And in the quiet nursery that night, as she rocked Micah to sleep, Ashlyn whispered to herself the words she hadn't dared say since the day they were born. They look like Malik. But Malik was not their father. She believed that. She had to believe that. Even if her own doubt had started whispering back. The weeks that followed were a blur of sleepless nights, crying infants, and a growing emotional gap between Ashlyn and Cameron. She tried to focus on the babies, feeding schedules, doctor appointments, skin-to-skin contact, but there was no denying the weight in the air. Cameron had become a shadow in their home, present, but distant, helpful but cold. He held the babies, yes. He changed diapers, prepared bottles, and even rocked them to sleep on occasion. But he did it with the same mechanical energy as someone clocking into a job they no longer wanted. The warmth that once defined him, the spontaneous kisses, the little jokes, the tender looks, was gone.
Ashlyn knew why.
They had not spoken about the boy's appearance since that moment in the hospital. But the silence was loud.
It infected everything.
At dinner, they barely talked. In bed, they lay inches apart, back to back. When Cameron looked at the babies, there was no joy in his eyes, only calculation, as if he were constantly searching for proof that they were his. Then one evening, it happened. Ashlyn was sitting on the living room floor, folding a mountain of tiny onesies. Jaden was fussing in his swing, Noah was dozing in the crib, and Micah was on her lap, cooing softly. Cameron came in from work, removed his shoes at the door, and walked to the kitchen without a word. She heard the refrigerator open and close, the clink of a bottle on the countertop. "Do you want dinner?" she asked quietly, not looking up.
I'm not hungry.
His tone was flat, and she felt the tension crawling up her spine. She didn't want to fight. Not in front of the kids. Not now. But he stood there, unmoving, holding a beer in his hand. Then, after a long silence, he said it. "I think we should get a paternity test." The words dropped like a bomb.
Ashlyn froze.
Her fingers clenched the fabric of the onesie in her hands. Micah stirred on her lap, sensing the shift in energy. She looked up at Cameron slowly, as if unsure she'd heard him correctly. "What did you say?" Cameron didn't blink.
You want to know the truth.
"I think we both do."
The truth.
Her voice was sharp now.
You don't believe me. I don't know what to believe, Ashlyn.
You never told me you had a past with Malik.
Ashlyn S. briscogt.
Are you spying on me now? No, he said. But your mother let it slip. She thought I knew. That you two had been close. And I did the math. She stood, placing Micah gently in the bassinet. Her hands were trembling, her jaw clenched. One night, she said coldly. One mistake. Before we got back together. Before you ever apologized. Before you showed up at my office with your flowers and your promises. You didn't think that was something I should know? It didn't matter, she shouted.
I chose you.
I married you.
I built a life with you.
Cameron looked down at the floor, jaw tight. And now we have 3 kids who don't look like either of us. Ashlyn's voice dropped. It was quiet, but sharp as glass. They don't look like you, Cameron. But they are mine. They came from me. Every breath they take started inside me. And if you can't accept that, maybe you don't belong here. The words shocked even her. But they were out now, impossible to take back. He looked up, wounded, but said nothing. Just left the room. That night, they didn't speak. Not the next day either. Cameron began sleeping on the couch. Ashlyn felt herself slipping, emotionally, physically, mentally. The lack of rest, the constant demands of 3 newborns, and the emotional strain were draining her. She barely ate. She barely remembered what day it was. Then came Cameron's parents. They arrived unannounced one Saturday morning, carrying a large basket of baby supplies and polite smiles. Ashlyn welcomed them with the bare minimum of civility. She had no energy for pretenses. The boys were napping in the bedroom, and she let them in without fuss. Cameron's mother asked to see the nursery. His father lingered in the kitchen, scanning the apartment like it was an exhibit. After a few moments, his mother returned to the living room, face stiff. They're beautiful, she said.
Ashlyn said nothing.
There was a long silence. Then Cameron's father cleared his throat. You know, he began, we don't want to interfere. But families talk. And people wonder. It would be easier for everyone if there was clarity. Ashlyn turned slowly to look at him. Clarity. About the boys, he said carefully. It's not just about you and Cameron. It's about the family name. About the legacy.
She almost logged.
But her voice was steady. The only legacy I care about is raising children who don't grow up ashamed of who they are. His wife reached for his arm, trying to stop him, but he shrugged her off.
Cameron deserves to know.
And if you really have nothing to hide.
Ashlyn stood.
I think it's time for you to leave. They stared at her. Now. Cameron didn't defend her. He watched silently as his parents gathered their things and left without another word. After the door closed, Ashlyn turned to him. Do you agree with them?
Cameron hesitated. I don't know.
That was worse than a yes. 3 days later, Ashlyn sat in the nursery, surrounded by silence and the soft breathing of her sons. She picked up an old notebook and began writing a letter. She wrote everything, the night with Malik, the guilt, the doubt, the fear. She poured her truth into ink, her hands trembling as she signed her name. She didn't plan to send it. Just needed to let it exist somewhere outside her mind. Then she tore it up. Ripped it into small, jagged pieces and flushed them down the toilet. She couldn't give Cameron the satisfaction of claiming she had lied. But the letter had left a mark on her heart, a permanent reminder that the truth, once written, could never truly be erased. That night, she held her sons close and whispered to them through tears. I don't know what's going to happen. But I promise, I will never let anyone make you feel like you don't belong. Outside, the city buzzed with life. Inside, Ashlyn felt her world shrinking, collapsing into a single promise: protect her children, no matter the cost. The tension in the apartment had solidified into something unspoken and sharp.
Ashlyn could feel it in every room, every glance, every silence.
Cameron remained distant, functional but emotionally absent. They no longer argued, they didn't even have the energy. Instead, they operated like co-workers in a poorly managed office, handing off tasks, exchanging schedules, barely looking each other in the eyes. The boys were growing fast. At 3 months, they had already begun to develop distinct personalities. Jaden was the loudest, always first to cry and first to smile. Noah was more sensitive, often requiring extra time and touch to calm. Micah was observant, quiet, always watching the world with wide, solemn eyes. Ashlyn spent most of her days alone with them, while Cameron buried himself in work. On the rare evenings he returned early, he went straight to the nursery, spending silent moments with the boys but rarely with her. Sometimes he stared at them as if trying to decipher a code. Other times he left the room quickly, as though it hurt to stay too long. One night, while rocking Noah to sleep, Ashlyn caught Cameron standing in the hallway outside the door, watching. She didn't acknowledge him at first. When she finally did turn, their eyes met. "Do you ever think they'll ask?" he asked quietly. "Ask what?" "Why they look the way they do." Ashlyn felt something sink in her chest. "They'll ask," she said. "And when they do, we'll tell them the truth that matters. That they are loved. That they were wanted." Cameron looked away. "And when they ask if I'm really their father?" Ashlyn's grip on Noah tightened slightly. "You are their father. You raised them.
You hold them. You wake up at night. That is what matters."
He shook his head slowly. "You still haven't told me the truth." Her voice lowered. "You think there's some truth that will make you feel better? That will erase your doubt?" "There's not." He didn't reply. The next morning, Ashlyn awoke to find a pamphlet on the kitchen table. A private DNA testing service, discreet and confidential. No note. No explanation. Just the glossy fold of suspicion lying open like an accusation. She didn't mention it. Just picked it up and dropped it into the trash. 2 days later, Cameron didn't come home. No call. No message.
Juste absence.
Ashlyn paced the apartment until midnight, fed the boys in silence, and finally fell asleep with Jaden curled beside her on the couch. At 2:30 a.m., she awoke to the sound of a key in the lock. Cameron stepped in, looking drained. He smelled faintly of whiskey. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice brittle. "Out," he said, setting down his keys. "You didn't call." "I needed space." Ashlyn stood, fury rising in her chest. "You disappear for an entire day without a word, and your only excuse is that you needed space?" He looked at her, exhausted. "I needed to think." "About what? Whether to stay, whether to leave, whether to love your own children." His jaw tightened.
He had the test done. The word knocked the wind out of her.
She stared at him, her body cold. Her heartbeat slowed, then pounded faster than before. "You had no right." "I had every right," he snapped.
You wouldn't tell me the truth.
"You tore up the only answer I had."
He couldn't live in this limbo anymore. Ashlyn stepped back, eyes burning.
"You think a piece of paper defines our family?" "I think facts matter." "Then here's a fact," she said, voice rising. "You've been gone since the day they were born. You might have been in the room, but you weren't with us. You checked out the moment you saw their skin. You couldn't love them unconditionally because you've never known how." Cameron stared at her, wounded. "The results will come in 2 days," he said quietly. "Then we'll know." Ashlyn couldn't sleep that night. She lay on the nursery floor between the 3 bassinets, staring at the ceiling. Every few minutes, a soft coo or murmur would stir from one of the babies, and she would crawl to their side, adjusting a blanket, whispering a word of comfort. 2 days later, Cameron came home early. Ashlyn was in the nursery again, nursing Noah. He stood in the doorway with an envelope in his hand. She didn't look at him. He didn't open it. Instead, he walked to the crib, set the envelope on the dresser, and watched Micah sleep. "I don't want to open it," he said finally. Ashlyn turned slightly. "Then don't." He swallowed. "But I already did."
Ashlyn froze.
"And?" There was a long silence.
"I'm the father."
"Of all 3. Her breath caught. Relief, anger, vindication, and heartbreak swirled in her chest all at once. She looked at him. Really looked. For the first time in weeks, maybe months. "And now?" she asked. He didn't have an answer. That night, Ashlyn didn't speak to him. Not because she was angry. She had no words left to give. Instead, She sat beside her babies, stroking their hair, whispering lullabies. And when the tears finally came, they were quiet. They weren't for Cameron. They were for the months she'd spent questioning herself.
For the glance. The accusation. The silence.
They were for the nights she had held their sons alone, wondering if the man she had married was ever really there. They were for the letter she had torn up, for the moment she had believed her story didn't matter unless someone else validated it. In the living room, Cameron sat with his head in his hands, the torn envelope on the floor beside him. Outside, the city lights flickered on, unaware of the small war that had just ended in a quiet apartment on the edge of Charleston. And though peace had returned, Ashlyn knew one thing for certain. Some fractures do not disappear when the truth arrives. They simply change shape. And some silences, once broken, can never be mended. The days after the paternity results came in were strangely calm. Cameron, now faced with a truth he could no longer run from, tried to adjust. He returned to his role in the home with renewed effort, waking in the night to help with feedings, folding laundry without being asked, and making small talk over dinner. But Ashlyn saw through it. His movements were careful, measured, as though he were acting a part he had been forced to play. Trust, she realized, wasn't something that could be resurrected with paperwork. The damage had already been done, not just by the test, but by everything that came before it. The suspicion.
The silence.
The moment he stood by and watched his parents question her integrity without stepping in. She couldn't unsee any of it. Still she tried, for the boys. For the dream she once believed they shared. One afternoon, while the triplets napped, Ashlyn sat across from Cameron at the kitchen table. A bowl of uneaten cereal sat between them, soggy and forgotten. "I'm going to visit my parents next weekend," she said, not looking at him. He nodded. "Okay. All of you?" "Yes." "How long?" "I don't know yet."
Et hésita-t-elle. Chaudit comme.
She didn't answer. The question hung in the air like fog, too thick to clear. That weekend, Ashlyn packed the boys into the SUV, triple-checked the car seats, and set off for Montgomery. The road stretched ahead of her like a lifeline, miles of silence, broken only by soft baby murmurs and the hum of tires against asphalt. The farther she drove, the lighter she felt, like she was peeling away layers of pain with every passing mile. Her parents welcomed her with open arms. Her father, Samuel Carter, still recovering from his stroke months earlier, moved slower now, speaking with deliberate effort. His speech had been affected, his right hand trembled slightly when he reached for his grandson's. But the look in his eyes, fierce, protective, unwavering, had not changed. Ashlyn watched him cradle Jaden, his lips moving in soft, slurred syllables. He looked up at her and smiled, his eyes damp. "You okay?" he managed to say. She nodded, but her eyes filled with tears.
Amir now.
Her mother, Denise, took charge like she always had. She bathed the babies, made meals, and insisted Ashlyn nap while she had the chance. For the first time in months, Ashlyn allowed herself to rest, not just her body, but her mind. On the third night, while the boys slept in the nursery her mother had hurriedly transformed, Ashlyn sat on the back porch with her father. The Alabama night was warm, filled with the buzz of insects and the rustle of leaves in the wind. "I need to ask you something," she said softly. He turned his head, giving her his full attention. "When I told you what happened, about Cameron, the doubts, everything, you never questioned me." "Not once." "Why?" Samuel's eyes narrowed, his brows knitting together as he searched for the right words. "Because I know you," he said slowly. "And because I've seen what it does." What does?" "The doubt."
The silence. The women disappear without leaving.
Ashlyn looked at him, surprised. He rarely spoke of his past, especially the years before meeting her mother. "My father," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "He left," said my mother, "had a child, that wasn't his. She begged, cried. He still walked away." Ashlyn blinked, stunned. "I didn't know."
Because he
"Never wanted you to carry that story." She reached over and took his hand.
I guess now we do.
He squeezed back with a fragile strength. The next morning, an unexpected knock at the door startled everyone. Denise was in the kitchen. Samuel was changing Micah. Ashlyn opened the door with a towel over her shoulder, her shirt still damp from a bottle spill. Malik stood on the porch. He looked older.
L'inné.
His hair was cropped close, and his expression was unreadable. "Hey," he said simply. Ashlyn stepped outside, closing the door behind her. "What are you doing here?" "I heard from a friend that you were in town." Didn't mean to show up unannounced." "You did anyway." He nodded, accepting the truth. "I just wanted to see if you were okay." Ashlyn studied him. The last time she had seen him, she had walked out of his apartment with shame clinging to her like smoke. And now here he was, quiet, calm, standing on her parents' porch like he belonged in the story again. "I'm okay," she said after a moment. Barely. But still standing. He looked down, then back up at her.
Amno tire tout complicat anything.
I heard you had kids. Triplets." She didn't answer. "I'd like to meet them. Just once." Her heart pounded. She didn't know what she felt, fear, anger, or something else. She hadn't expected to ever see him again, let alone have him ask for access to the part of her life she'd protected most. "They're not yours," she said flatly. "We had a night. It was a mistake. That's it." He nodded. "I know. Then why are you here?" "Because when I saw a photo, and I looked into that kid's eyes,
I saw something.
I saw you. And maybe, just maybe, I saw me too." She took a step back, shaken. "I need you to leave." He didn't argue. "Okay." He started to turn, then paused. "For what it's worth, I never stopped hoping you'd be happy." Ashlyn stood frozen as he walked back to his car and drove away. Inside, her mother stood at the window, having seen everything. "You all right?" she asked. Ashlyn didn't respond. She walked to the nursery, sat beside the cribs, and let her thoughts unravel. She had always believed she could control the story, hide the wrong chapters, emphasize the best lines, keep the plot clean and safe. But stories don't stay in the past. They rise. They breathe. They knock on the door when you least expect them. And for the first time, Ashlyn wasn't sure she could hold this one together. All she could do was protect her children. From others.
From the past.
And maybe, most of all, from herself. Ashlyn stayed in Montgomery longer than planned. Days turned into weeks. What had started as a break had quietly become a retreat. Back home, her mother took over the practical matters of daily life, and her father's presence offered a steady comfort, even in his slowed state. In their family home, among familiar walls and childhood memories, Ashlyn could finally breathe. But rest wasn't peace. Every night, once the boys were asleep and the house had gone still, the questions came. Not from others, from within. Had she done the right thing by leaving Cameron behind? Should she have confronted Malik more directly? Should she have told her parents everything from the start? Each night she would replay the same scenes, searching for signs she had missed, words she had left unsaid, moments she had buried too quickly. Then, one humid afternoon, Denise found a letter in the mailbox addressed to Ashlyn. There was no return name, only a local address in faded ink. Inside the envelope was a brief handwritten note and a worn photograph. Ashlyn read it once, then again, heart tightening as the words sank in. The letter was from Marilyn Blake, Cameron's mother. She had tracked down Ashlyn's address through mutual acquaintances, despite their silence since the tense visit in Charleston. The note was oddly gentle, lacking the judgment that once lined her voice.
Ashlyn,
I know I am the last person you want to hear from. But I owe you the truth. Not for my son, not even for the boys, but for you. There are things I've carried for too long, and I won't take them with me when I go. I've sent this photo because it's the only one I have.
The man bézide me istoma, Cameronaise biological fater.
We were 19. I was naive and in love with someone my family would never accept. He was brilliant, kind, and yes, black. I never told Cameron. My parents forced me to marry someone else, and I buried the past. When I saw your boys for the first time, I knew. They don't look like Malik. They look like Thomas. They look like Cameron. I failed to protect you from suspicion, and I will always regret that.
Forgive me if you can. Marilyn.
Ashlyn stared at the photograph. A young Marilyn, barely recognizable, stood next to a tall man with warm eyes and a wide smile. He had Cameron's jawline.
Noah's eyes.
Jaden's cheekbones. And just like that, the truth shifted again. Cameron wasn't white, not entirely. And he had never known. The man he called father had raised him, but the man in the photograph had passed along the genetic thread that explained everything: the skin tones, the bone structure, the undeniable resemblance. Ashlyn walked into the backyard, the letter trembling in her hand, and sat on the steps of the old wooden deck. The boys were inside napping. Denise watched from the kitchen window but didn't follow her. She stayed outside until dusk. When the sun dipped below the trees, Ashlyn picked up her phone and called Cameron. He answered after the third ring. "It's me," she said. "I got a letter from your mother." A long silence followed. "She's dying," he said quietly. "Cancer. She didn't want anyone to know." Ashlyn closed her eyes. "She told me about Thomas." "I just found out a week ago," Cameron added. "She told me everything." "Why didn't you call me?" "I didn't know what to say." Ashlyn nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Now you understand, don't you?" she asked. "Yes." There was a strange pause between them. A moment of shared grief neither had expected. "You should come see the boys," she said eventually. "They need to know you're still here."
Idée like that.
They didn't talk long after that.
No apologie, no déclaration.
Just an acknowledgement that something had changed, again. The next day, Cameron arrived in Montgomery. He looked thinner, paler, older. When he stepped into the living room and saw the boys, all three now sitting up with assistants, he froze. They stared at him curiously, as if trying to place a forgotten face. Then Noah reached out. Cameron dropped to his knees and let his son crawl into his lap. Jaden followed. Micah hung back, quiet as always, but his eyes never left his father.
Ashlyn stood in the doorway, watching.
She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply let the moment pass through her, unsure what to feel. That night, after the boys had been fed and put to bed, Cameron sat on the porch steps beside her. "Do you think I can still be a father to them?" he asked. "You never stopped being one," she replied. "You just stopped showing up." He looked down. "I'm sorry."
For everything.
Ashlyn nodded. "I know." They sat in silence for a while. "I'm not asking to come back," he said. "I just want to do this right. From now on." Ashlyn turned to him.
Then do it. Be here.
Be present. They don't need perfect. They just need real. He nodded. Over the next few days, Cameron stayed in Montgomery. He helped with bottles, read bedtime stories, and listened to Denise's instructions without argument. Samuel watched him carefully, slowly warming to his presence. Ashlyn observed from a distance, allowing him space but not yet lowering her guard.
Then, one morning, Ashlyn found Malik standing on the sidewalk outside the house.
He didn't approach the door. Just waited. She stepped out onto the porch. "I heard Cameron's here," he said. "He is." "You don't have to say anything," he continued. "I just wanted to say goodbye."
For real this time.
Ashlyn studied him. "You don't want to come in?" "No," he said. "It's not my place. It never really was." She nodded. "Thank you, for being honest."
For letting it go.
Malik smiled faintly. "Take care of them, Ashlyn."
You're stronger than you think.
She watched him walk away without looking back. Later that evening, Cameron sat at the kitchen table, feeding Micah mashed bananas while Ashlyn sorted laundry. "I want to set up a co-parenting plan," he said.
Something clear.
Consistent. For them. Ashlyn looked at him, then nodded. "Okay. We can talk to someone about that." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reunion. But it was something solid, something real. And as she tucked the boys in that night, whispering softly to each of them, Ashlyn felt a small shift inside her. Not closure, not yet. But direction. Forward. The weight of inheritance, of secrets passed down, of truths long hidden, had nearly torn them apart. Now, slowly, they were learning how to carry it together. Ashlyn never returned to Charleston. The idea of going back to the apartment where everything had unraveled, the doubt, the silence, the coldness, felt suffocating. Instead, she found a small rental house in Montgomery near her parents' neighborhood, a modest two-bedroom with a shaded backyard and creaky wooden floors. It wasn't much, but it was hers. A space where she could rebuild something stable for the boys and for herself. Cameron returned to Charleston after his brief stay, but not without promises. He would visit twice a month, contribute financially, and stay involved in decisions about the boys' health and education. True to his word, he kept the schedule. He drove the 6 hours every other weekend, never late, never canceling, often sleeping on the couch or in a nearby motel. It was a rhythm that suited them, distant, respectful, and carefully defined. There were no blurred lines, no unexpected gestures, no conversations about the past beyond what was necessary for co-parenting. And for a while, that was enough. But the past, Ashlyn knew, had a way of resurfacing. Sometimes it came quietly. Sometimes it demanded attention. One afternoon in late spring, while picking the boys up from their daycare, Ashlyn was approached by the director, a kind middle-aged woman named Ms. Reese. Her smile was thin, her eyes avoiding direct contact. "Ms. Carter, do you have a moment?" Ashlyn's chest tightened.
Is everything all right?
"It's nothing urgent," Ms. Reese assured her. "But there was an incident today, with Noah."
Ashlyn s'atsank.
"He's okay physically," Ms. Reese continued. "But one of the older children said something inappropriate." "What happened?"
Ashlyn précède.
"One of the children asked if Noah's real dad was black," she said gently. "And then asked if his mom had lied." Ashlyn closed her eyes briefly. "I'm so sorry," Ms. Reese added. "We're addressing it with the parents. But I thought you should know." Later that evening, after dinner, Ashlyn sat with Noah in her lap. He was quiet, his usual bubbly demeanor dulled. She brushed his hair back gently, searching for the right words. "Did someone say something to you today?" she asked. He looked away.
About Daddy?
Noah nodded slowly. "They said I'm not really yours and Daddy's." Ashlyn swallowed hard.
You are ours.
"In every way that matters. But why don't I look like him?" She took a deep breath. "Because people come in all kinds of colors, baby. You and your brothers have pieces of both of us. You have Daddy's smile.
And Mayan.
And a whole world of your own in those big eyes." He looked up at her, uncertain. "Am I different?" She hugged him tightly.
Different is beautiful.
"And you are the most perfect version of you that ever existed." That night, after the boys had gone to sleep, Ashlyn sat at the kitchen table and wrote an email to Cameron. She didn't sugarcoat the incident, didn't soften the edges. "This is going to happen again," she wrote. "We can't control what other people say, but we can control how we prepare our children for it. You need to have this conversation with them too." His reply came an hour later.
You're right. Tell me when.
They arranged a video call the next day. Cameron, sitting in his Charleston apartment, addressed the boys gently but directly. He told them he loved them. That being a father wasn't about skin color or genetics, it was about choosing to show up. Always. That there would be people who wouldn't understand, but that didn't make those people right. The boys didn't grasp everything, but Ashlyn saw something shift in them. A small seed of assurance. A sense that they were not alone. A few days later, Ashlyn received another letter, this time from Marilyn's attorney. Cameron's mother had passed away quietly the week before. The letter came with a copy of her will and a sealed envelope addressed to Ashlyn. Inside was a handwritten note and a second photograph, Marilyn holding a newborn Cameron in a hospital bed, a young man standing beside her. The same man from the earlier photo.
Thomas.
The note was brief.
Ashlyn.
"I'm sorry I didn't fight harder. You were right to protect your children. I failed to protect mine. Tell them who they are. Tell them where they come from.
Don't let silence reste them. Marilyn."
Ashlyn sat with the photo for a long time. Later that week, she added a framed copy of it to the boys' bookshelf. Not as a symbol of grief, but of recognition. Of history. Inspired by the letter, Ashlyn made a decision she had been putting off for months. She scheduled an appointment with a local therapist who specialized in family trauma and identity formation. She began attending weekly sessions, talking through her fears, her guilt, her anger, and her hopes. Slowly, she began to unpack the weight she had carried for too long. At the same time, she returned to legal work part-time, focusing on cases involving parental rights and support. Her time in court reminded her of her own strength, her ability to fight, not just for herself, but for those like her, women who had been questioned, erased, or ignored. One afternoon, she was invited to speak at a community center's parenting panel. She hesitated at first, but eventually agreed. When the day came, she stood in front of a room of tired mothers, anxious fathers, and confused teenagers. She told them a version of her story, not all the details, but the shape of it. She spoke of love, betrayal, suspicion, identity. Of the challenge of raising children who will be questioned simply for existing. She spoke of the cost of silence. And when she finished, no one clapped. Not at first.
Juste silence.
Then someone stood.
A woman in the back.
And she began to applaud. One by one, others joined in. Not loudly. Not with fanfare. But with quiet affirmation. That night, Ashlyn came home to the boys already asleep. Denise was on the couch, half watching an old movie. Ashlyn kissed her mother's forehead and slipped into the nursery. She stood over each crib in silence.
Jaden.
Noah. Micah. She thought of Malik, of Cameron, of Marilyn, of Thomas. Of herself. She had been afraid that the past would always define her children. But maybe it could also strengthen them. Maybe the truth wasn't just a weight to carry, but a tool to build with. Maybe this wasn't the end of the story, but the part where something new begins. By the time summer arrived, the boys were walking, clumsily, arms stretched for balance, feet unsure but determined. Every day brought new words, new sounds, new versions of the same laughter that had become the heartbeat of Ashlyn's world. Their voices filled the house like music, and she let them. Even the chaos was welcome. Life had settled into something resembling rhythm. Co-parenting with Cameron had become less strained, more cooperative. He was no longer trying to reclaim a role he'd once failed to uphold. Instead, he focused on what he could give now: time, patience, consistency. He never asked to stay the night, never stepped beyond the agreed-upon boundaries, and Ashlyn respected that. But something had shifted. The guardedness between them had softened. The anger had cooled into something more nuanced. Not affection, not yet, but recognition. They had been through something few people would understand. And they had survived it, in a way. One evening, after a long day in court, Ashlyn returned home to find Cameron already at the house, helping Denise with dinner while the boys built towers with plastic blocks on the living room floor. It was his weekend, and he had arrived early. She set down her briefcase, surprised.
You're early.
He smiled faintly. Figured I'd help out. Dinner passed uneventfully. Small talk, shared glances, a few laughs from the boys. Afterward, while Denise cleaned up, Ashlyn and Cameron sat outside on the porch, each with a glass of water in hand. The night air was warm, heavy with the scent of jasmine from the garden. I wanted to say thank you, Cameron said. For what? For not shutting me out completely. Ashlyn looked ahead into the dark yard. I tried. But the boys always pull the door back open. He nodded. I don't deserve it, he added. I know that.
Ashlyn let the silence settle.
You hurt me, she said finally. Not just when you doubted me, but when you stopped being present.
When you let your family speak for you.
When you didn't trust your own heart.
Et exhalait slowly.
I was scared. I grew up believing a version of myself that wasn't true. And when that was taken away, I didn't know what was left.
You should have let me in.
I should have. I didn't. I won't make that mistake again. Ashlyn turned to look at him. This isn't about you and me anymore. It's about them. I know. He stood up after a moment. I'm going to head out.
See you Sunday.
She nodded.
Drive safe.
As he walked to his car, she realized she wasn't angry anymore. She was tired, yes. But not bitter. Whatever wound had once bled inside her was no longer raw. It had closed, scarred, and perhaps even begun to heal. That weekend, Ashlyn received a message from Malik. Just a line. Thank you, for giving me closure. She hadn't expected to hear from him again. His text was brief, final, without need for response. But it stayed with her. Not in the way that reopened old wounds, but in a quiet, bittersweet way. He had been part of her journey, however brief, however complicated. And now, that chapter was closed. Ashlyn continued her part-time legal work at the community center. Her clients were often mothers like her, navigating co-parenting agreements, battling custody disputes, defending their voices in systems designed to ignore them. Her name slowly became known not just as a lawyer, but as a listener, someone who understood the unspoken struggles. She also began a monthly workshop, The Stories We Carry. It was a space where women shared personal narratives, not just of trauma, but of endurance, clarity, and transformation. The sessions were small, intimate, sometimes tearful, often healing. In one session, a young woman named Erica shared a story about being disbelieved by her own partner during pregnancy. About how her child's features were questioned, how her integrity was chipped away piece by piece. Ashlyn listened closely. When the woman finished, Ashlyn said, "You don't have to prove your worth. Not to anyone. Sometimes the only truth you owe is the one you live, every day, by loving your child." The room was quiet, but the message settled deep. Outside those meetings, Ashlyn's own life slowly became richer. Not easier, there were still long nights, fevers, tantrums, and the ever-growing expense of raising 3 boys, but she was no longer surviving. She was shaping something. Building a life, not from perfection, but from resilience. The boys began asking more questions.
Why do we live Irene daddy live somewhere else?
Jaden asked one morning while brushing his teeth. "Because that's how our family works right now," Ashlyn replied.
Do you love daddy?
She paused. "I love that he's your daddy. And I love you." That answer seemed to be enough. But Ashlyn knew one day it wouldn't be. One day they would need the whole story, not filtered, not distorted but real. She would tell it then. When they were old enough to understand pain without internalizing it. When they could distinguish between mistakes and malice. When they could carry the story without letting it define them.
One night, she stood alone on the porch again.
Her father joined her, walking slowly, cane in hand. He sat beside her without a word. "I thought I'd end up alone," she said softly. "You're not," he replied. "I don't mean romantically. I thought no one would understand." He looked out into the night, then turned to her. Understanding doesn't always come from others. Sometimes it comes when you stop needing their approval. Ashlyn looked at him, his lined face, the wisdom in his tired eyes. "I think I'm finally learning that." He smiled. "You've already taught it." Later, back inside, she checked on the boys one last time. They were sleeping soundly, tangled in blankets and stuffed animals, their small chests rising and falling in rhythm. She sat on the floor beside them, letting herself rest against the wall. She didn't think about what came next, school, work, parenting choices, or relationships. She thought only of now. This was what survival looked like, transformed. It was the quiet after the storm. It was not the end of hardship, but the beginning of something steadier. And maybe, just maybe, the shape of forgiveness didn't have to be soft or sentimental. Maybe it just looked like this.
3 boys sleeping soundly.
One mother finally at peace. And a life, however imperfect, being lived fully. The following autumn brought change, not sudden or dramatic, but steady, like the quiet turning of leaves. The boys were now 2.5, full of energy, questions, and laughter that echoed through every corner of Ashlyn's small house. They spoke in incomplete sentences, made demands with wide eyes and sticky fingers, and had opinions about everything from what to wear to which bedtime story should be read 3 times in a row. Ashlyn's days were a blur of motion, early breakfasts, daycare drop-offs, part-time legal work, grocery runs, parenting workshops, diaper changes, meltdowns, and stolen minutes of stillness. She'd grown stronger, not just in stamina but in resolve. The exhaustion no longer defeated her, it refined her. And in the rare moments she could pause, she found herself smiling more often. Cameron remained consistent in his involvement. He made the long drive to Montgomery every other weekend, sometimes bringing small gifts for the boys, always staying the exact number of hours they had agreed on. He never asked to stay longer. He never pressed for more. And though he was present, he had learned to live at the edge of Ashlyn's world, never pushing past the boundary she'd drawn. That was part of the healing too, learning where to end a story, and where to let something else begin. One crisp October afternoon, Ashlyn received a call from the local university. A professor in the sociology department had attended one of her community workshops and wanted to invite her to speak on a panel titled Motherhood in the Margins. They wanted her perspective, not as a legal expert, but as someone who had lived the conversation. At first, she hesitated. Speaking to a room full of academics and students wasn't the same as leading a community group. But after a night of wrestling with doubt, she called back and accepted. She spent the week leading up to the event preparing notes in the late hours after the boys had fallen asleep. She thought about everything she had experienced: the betrayal, the shame, the judgment, the silence, the resilience. And she thought about the stories other women had shared with her, stories not so different from her own. On the day of the panel, Ashlyn stood in a modest auditorium filled with students, faculty, and community members. The other speakers were scholars, eloquent and passionate, but when it was Ashlyn's turn, the room shifted. She didn't speak with academic precision. She spoke with lived truth. "I'm not here to defend my choices," she began. "I'm here because there are women like me everywhere, women who are forced to explain themselves, to prove their worth, to defend their children's right to exist without suspicion." She paused, letting the silence stretch before continuing. "I was questioned by the man I married. By his family. By étranger. I was judged because my children didn't look like him. And for a time, I judged myself too. I let their doubts infect my sense of who I was." Ashlyn's voice didn't shake. It had taken her a long time to get here. "But what I've learned is this: there's no one right way to be a family. Love isn't always neat. It isn't always clean or easy. Sometimes it's messy, painful, and full of wrong turns. But if you keep showing up, if you keep telling the truth, even when your voice trembles, you create something real." There was quiet applause, not the thunderous kind, but the kind that came from people who had heard something they'd needed to hear. After the panel, students approached her with questions, professors asked for her contact information, and one young woman simply hugged her without saying a word. Later that night, back at home, Ashlyn stood in front of her bathroom mirror and looked at herself. Not just her face, but all of her. She saw the lines beneath her eyes, the curve of her shoulders, the quiet strength in her posture. This was the body that had carried 3 children, endured heartbreak, held up under judgment, and kept moving forward. She didn't need to change a thing. 2 days later, Cameron arrived for his weekend visit. He seemed quieter than usual, distracted. After putting the boys down for their afternoon nap, he approached Ashlyn in the kitchen. "I'm moving," he said. She looked up. "Phare. New Orleans. The firm offered me a promotion. Big project. Better pay. More flexibility." She nodded slowly. "That's good. Congratulations." "I wanted to tell you in person," he added. "I'll still come to see them. I'll work something out. Fly in. Extended weekends." "What veritak?" Ashlyn studied him for a moment. "I believe you." He seemed surprised. "I know you weren't always there," she said. "But you're here now. And you've shown me you want to be part of their lives. That matters." He exhaled, visibly relieved. "I'll talk to the lawyer. Get everything set up before the move." They stood in silence for a beat. "I'm proud of you," Cameron said softly. Ashlyn blinked. "For what?" "For making it. For building this life. For being a better parent than I ever knew how to be." She smiled faintly. "I didn't build it alone. But I finished it on my own terms." That night, after he left, Ashlyn sat on the front steps while the boys slept. The air was cool, the sky clear. She pulled a blanket around her shoulders and looked up at the stars. It struck her how much had changed. Not just in her life, but in her heart. She was no longer waiting for apology, for validation, for someone to explain the past. She had made peace with it. Not all at once, but piece by piece. Forgiveness, she'd learned, wasn't about forgetting. It wasn't even about healing someone else's mistakes. It was about reclaiming space inside yourself. Letting go of the grip that pain had on your breath. Creating room for something else to grow. She stood, stretched, and walked back inside. In the nursery, the boys stirred in their sleep. She kissed each forehead, whispering the same words she had whispered since they were born. "You are enough. You are wanted. You are loved." Tomorrow would bring more questions, more chaos, more choices. But tonight, there was quiet. And in that quiet, Ashlyn finally felt free. Years passed quietly, not with sudden shifts or grand moments, but in the slow layering of ordinary days. The boys turned 5, then 6, each of them blossoming into their own shape of wonder. Jaden became the loudest and most confident, always raising his hand first, always asking why. Noah, ever the observer, leaned into books and quiet spaces, his imagination blooming in silence. And Micah, still the most solemn, developed a calm presence that soothed both his brothers and the grown-ups around him. Ashlyn watched them grow like seasons watch trees, sometimes without noticing the change, until one day she realized their shoes no longer fit, their questions had grown deeper, and their arms could wrap all the way around her waist. She had moved again, into a modest but sunlit house not far from the school they would soon attend. Her legal work had shifted from individual advocacy to directing a program that trained young women in navigating family law and systems of care. She was now not only a mentor but a model. Her name carried weight in her community, not because she had chased success, but because she had lived through something, and chosen to stay and teach others how to keep going. Cameron, now based in New Orleans, visited every month like clockwork. The arrangement had stabilized. The boys adored their father, but they also understood the limits of his presence. They never confused proximity with love, because Ashlyn had never let them feel unloved in his absence. She and Cameron had even grown to speak easily again, exchanging updates, sharing laughter over the boys' antics, and occasionally reflecting on how far they had come. There was no lingering bitterness. Only mutual respect and an understanding that some partnerships were never meant to be romantic forever, but still deserved to be whole. And then one afternoon, it happened. Jaden asked the question. They had been walking home from school. The air was crisp, leaves crunching under their feet, backpacks bouncing as the boys skipped beside her. "Mom," he asked, "why did you and Daddy stop being married?" Ashlyn didn't pause. She had known this day would come.
Sti, had bitlude.
"That's a good question," she said, bending down slightly to match his pace.
Want tout au when we get home.
He nodded. Later, when the boys had finished their snacks, she gathered them in the living room. All three sat cross-legged on the rug, watching her expectantly. It wasn't the first difficult conversation they'd had, but it felt different, heavier, more defining. She didn't read from a book. She didn't prepare a speech. She just began. "Your dad and I loved each other a lot when we were younger. We had big dreams. We made plans. And then, life happened.
It got complicated.
We made mistakes. We hurt each other. And even though we both tried to fix it, we couldn't make it work as husband and wife." "Did he leave?" Noah asked softly.
Ashlyn Maysaiz.
"He didn't walk away from you. He struggled to understand some things. And that hurt me. But he came back. And he worked hard to be a good dad." "But you're not mad anymore?" Micah asked. Ashlyn smiled gently. "No. I was. For a long time. But I learned that being mad doesn't help anyone if you carry it forever. I forgave him. And I forgave myself too." Jaden tilted his head.
Why yourself?
"Because I made choices I wasn't always proud of. I kept things hidden. I let fear guide me instead of trust. And when you grow up, you'll learn that even adults don't always get it right." They sat in thoughtful silence. She waited.
No one cried.
No one asked who was to blame. They just nodded, processing the truth like children do, with acceptance that adults often forget how to practice. That night, Ashlyn sat at her desk and began writing. She didn't know yet if it would become a book, a letter, or just a document stored away for the future. But the words came easily. She wrote about betrayal and forgiveness. About doubt and healing. About the way love could morph into something else, something no less meaningful, just different. She wrote about Malik, though his name appeared only once. She wrote about Marilyn, about the photograph of Thomas, about the inheritance of silence, and the courage it took to break it. She wrote about each of her sons, not as symbols, but as full beings, born into complexity, but not defined by it. She wrote, most of all, for herself. For the version of her who had once stood in the rain with a torn paper bag and a broken heart. For the version of her who had held 3 newborns with no idea how to hold herself. For the version of her who had thought survival meant shrinking.
Now she knew better.
The next week, she stood in front of a group of new mothers at a support circle. One of them, barely 20 and visibly overwhelmed, asked Ashlyn the question she had once asked herself. How do you know if you're doing enough? Ashlyn didn't hesitate.
You won't always feel like you are.
But if you're still showing up, if you're still choosing to love even when it's hard, you're doing more than enough. The woman nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. When the session ended, Ashlyn stayed behind to help clean. As she gathered chairs and folded blankets, a quiet calm settled over her. She wasn't chasing peace anymore. She was living inside it. Back at home, the boys were gathered in the living room, building a city out of blocks. Jaden was assigning everyone roles, Noah was designing the road system, and Micah was in charge of protecting the imaginary library from dragons. Ashlyn sat on the couch, watching them. Her phone buzzed on the side table, an email from a local publisher interested in her story. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she leaned back and closed her eyes, letting the sound of her sons fill the room. This was the story she would tell. Not just of pain. Not just of survival. But of becoming. Of learning how to stand, not in spite of what she had lived through, but because of it. And as the sun set behind the windows, casting long golden shadows across the rug, Ashlyn whispered a quiet truth to herself. She had made it. On her own terms. And she was just getting started.